Welcome to this session on digitalizing your sanctions, your PEPs, politically exposed people lists, and your regulatory duties with SAP. Very pleased to welcome you to the session, and I'm excited also to have Prof. Bob Wardrop on the call with me from Red Genome. And I think we'll just introduce our companies just a tiny bit, and then we'll actually jump into the session itself. So Bob, if you could go on to the next slide, please. So I'll introduce Winterhawk. I work for Winterhawk, and then hand over to Bob, who'll then take you through Red Genome and the first part of the session. He'll switch back to me, and I'll then talk through some other parts of it. So I work for Winterhawk, and we're unusually in the world at the moment anyway, specifically focused on SAP technologies. And our sweet spot really is the broader topic of governance and data protection, financial and regulatory protection. And you'll see that from the list of the areas that we support, that we cover the core topics of GRC, but that's a very broad topic. So also including things like business assurance, sanctions, regulations, cyber, process automation, and of course today's topic, which is around regulatory challenges and, for example, PEPs and sanction lists. Okay, Bob, I will then hand over to you.
Thanks, Neil. As Neil mentioned, I work with Red Genome. In fact, I'm the founder and I'm the executive chairman of the company. That's one hat I wear. The other hat I wear is I'm a professor of finance in the University of Cambridge. And I started a research center several years ago, the Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance, and a large research project involving regulatory data was a real focus of one of those research projects and really led to spinning Red Genome out of the University of Cambridge. So Red Genome is a regulatory data technology company. What it means is, and I'll explain this in the upcoming slides, is we're very focused on creating structured regulatory data. And we'll talk about the form in which it's produced today, which is not exactly structured. And we're kind of rare in doing that. I think there are other providers of regulatory data, but ours has some particular aspects to it that I think, combined with Winterhawk, offer a tremendous solution to firms as they try to understand and manage their regulatory risks. So managing the regulatory environment is one of the things I'm going to be focusing on. How do we understand it? How do we manage it? And why is it so difficult? And I think there's four key factors that really contribute to that challenge that I'm going to talk about before I pass over to Neil to talk about how we address those challenges and how a solution can be implemented in the firm to overcome this difficulty. So first of all, no surprise to anyone, the volume of regulation is increasing. If we just take a look at the banking industry, you can see that starting in 2000, prior to 2000, you had Basel. Now you had Basel II. Now you've got Basel III, which came in 2021. So the regulatory landscape is constantly evolving. And again, this is just really for, broadly speaking, to some extent, securities regulators, but also banks and what they're having to contend with in terms of the volume of regulations and the number of regulatory authorities and jurisdictions that are pumping out regulation on an increasing volume, non-linear year on year. Aside from the specific regulations themselves, I think it's really important to reflect on the broader landscape of what we call regulatory relevant content, right? So I've got on the left here, this is some data that Red Genome we have pulled from our large repository, our corpus of global regulatory information, and I'll talk about that more in a little bit. But I'm just looking here at two themes, regulatory themes, one anti-money laundering, counter financial terrorism, and cyber, one in 21 jurisdictions, the other one in 18 jurisdictions. It's not just the obligations that a firm is subject to, that a firm needs to ingest or understand to manage the regulatory environment. We've got 12 or 13 different types on the left here. Consultations, calls for input, technical standards, guidance and FAQs, policies and decisions, evidence and opinion, the laws themselves. Legal department is concerned with the laws, perhaps more than they are with the actual regulations, and you need the laws to set the context for the regulations that are introduced that then drive the standards. But also speeches can signal what is a regulatory trend or what's likely to turn into a policy. but also enforcement actions. How stringent is a given jurisdiction in actually enforcing the regulations? So a lot of this needs to be analyzed and understood to gain a full picture, full visibility on the regulatory landscape per firm. And of course, another factor driving complexity, this challenge of understanding the regulatory environment, is geopolitical divergence. I won't go on about that. I think everybody understands and can pick up the paper every day. To understand geopolitical divergence drives the creation of rules and regulations in different jurisdictions that extraterritorially is an expression we use to increase the influence of a given jurisdiction or region globally. GPDR is an excellent example. Launched in Europe, but if you're operating and doing anything in Europe, you may be a US company, but the reality is that kind of sets your bar for how you're going to deal with data privacy. Because you can't have different rules, different internal compliance policies, controls, etc., for every jurisdiction you're operating in. You need to set the bar somewhere. Often one approach is you select perhaps the most stringent environment and baseline everything off of that. So jurisdictions understand that. Policymakers understand that. So there's jockeying going on that's really producing, in some cases, even within a jurisdiction. And I think that the US is a good case in point between state and federal level issues. You can actually have contradictory regulations. So how do you understand where the opportunities for harmonization might be, where you can implement a policy that satisfies more than one regulatory requirement across more than one jurisdiction, across more than one regulatory authority that you're subject to? So we've taken a snapshot again of our data just to give you a feel for sanctions updates alone. So this is not sanction regulation. These are just new entries to sanction lists published by the European Commission and the US State Department. Of course, two extremely important sources, but not the only sources. If you just look at the past 120 days, you see what we call the turbulence of some of the change that's going on, with 250 new entries in the EU appearing in June, August, and October, and almost 300 from the US Department of State in August, October, and November. So again, sometimes one could make a case that sanctions and these entries are to some extent, in some cases, a product of this geopolitical divergence. And so this would all be more manageable if regulation was published in a different form than it's published in today. So this is about form over substance. Forget about what the regulations say. That's complex enough in terms of how all that's changing. But regulations today are published in a human readable form. I would say regulatory authorities are probably 20 years behind in publishing content, whether it be rule books, whether it be enforcement actions, in some form of structured data that can be directly ingested by a firm into its processes, its workflows, its systems, its solutions, to help manage the burden of regulatory intelligence, compliance reporting, that whole domain. So it means then that there is a transformation needed to take it from the form it's published, largely PDFs. And I've got some information here on the right. You know, FINRA in the US is probably advanced as anyone through its API and its creation of a machine readable rule book, but they really only covered about 50% of it. It was intensively manual. And I think FINRA itself would admit, because we know them well, it's been a huge challenge. So no time soon, in my opinion, are regulators going to start publishing in the machine readable form you need. So this is what we call the form factor problem. I mean, it's really problematic, right? You want to unlock this information from unstructured human form, again, mostly PDF, because you want to triage it, process it, identify it, route it. So this is forcing you into manual processes. It means you have to look at expensive resources like lawyers. It's because they're human. That's not machine consumption. Very capital intensive, because you really have processes that are repeated across use cases, activities, jurisdictions. I've had one player say to me, or one industry player say, we have dozens of versions of AML, KYC, customer due diligence for example, representation of the obligation set because, product bought something, risk bought something, Mexico bought something, the UK bought something, all different applications. None of them talk to each other. None of them can go across solutions. So you end up with multiple inconsistent data structures. It's very difficult to get a consistent, standardized, consolidated view of the regulatory posture. So the bottom line is that we would argue that machines need interoperable regulatory data that can be used across multiple workflows and systems. That's how you're going to get there. And as you're digitally transforming workflows and processes, having this interoperable data becomes critical to move it across workflows and systems. So that's what we really do at RegGenome. We're tackling that specific problem, what we call the form factor problem. We're aggregating at scale, millions and millions of documents, text extracting, applying sophisticated AI-based models to actually create sets of metadata that describe in some detail what is in that document. And that metadata can be read by a machine. So the link with that document as published by that source is still there, but in fact, it can be effectively read in a solution or a machine-based application because you have the metadata that can be integrated into that solution or application. And so that's that aggregating and structuring text. This is all still external to the organization. And this is a scale-driven business. It's hard to do well. It's hard to do at the quality level. To create what I just described as that interoperable machine-readable format. And so at that point, we hand it over to a solution provider, an application, where it can be ingested into the firm. And that's to the right. It goes internal. But our expertise is not the solution or application layer. Our expertise is the data layer. And that's that boundary line I've got in the middle here. And that is the perfect segue over to Neil, who's going to pick it up and take it into the firm. Neil, I'm going to stop sharing, so please bring up your deck, and it's all yours.
That is great. Thank you, Bob. Right, so I'll just share, get my deck up, and minimize that. Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen. And Bob, thank you. That is a real good setup. So let's dive into, as you're saying. So you've showed the outside view, the complexities around that, and I'm probably now shifting the lens, our discussion point, to being within the organization. And we're going to look at some pain points and some consequences of pain points, the complexity, and then how we can help deal with those for businesses these days. So maybe adding a bit more color to the complexity for the business conversations that Bob's opened up. On the right-hand side, you'll see a diagram. So this is a sanctions map from the EU set of sanctions. Now, I know if you guys are US-based, you're probably not that worried about EU, but I'm using this to illustrate part of the complexity for the business. So you'll see in the big red square there, or the big shape, that's for Belarus. And there are a lot of bluey circles. So each one of those circles represents a particular branch of sanctions. And these are all of the sanctions that apply to Belarus. And you'll see they've got for all the countries that the EU sanctions cover. And I wanted to illustrate this to show you the volume really and the complexity that companies need to deal with sanctions. And you'll see on the left-hand side there, I've got types of sanctions. So that's interesting as well, because depending which line of business you're in, or where these threats might be coming from, there could be multiple types of sanctions that you need to deal with. So economic, diplomatic, military, sports, environmental sanctions. And you need to prioritize those and deal with them individually. And as Bob was saying, these things can overlap, they can intersect. And two together could be more complex than just two, so that the sum of the whole could be bigger than the sum of the individuals in a bad way, not in a good way. And the key sources of sanctions, so we've got the UN, the US, OFAC. We'll come back to some OFAC use cases later on in one of the later slides. EU and the UK as a particular area of legislation. And I've got the EU candidate countries because any country that is looking for membership of the EU will have to apply to EU regulations. And if you have satellite offices or opcos operating in those candidate countries, you will need to deal with this. And that's part of the complexity as well. So although this is to a US audience, if you're in a global firm, you might have multiple jurisdictions that you need to comply with, whether you want to or not. And that's quite a good introduction to the next slide. So from an organizational perspective, sanctions are not optional. This is not something you can cherry pick and say, well, I'll worry about that set of sanctions, but not that set of sanctions. If you operate within those countries where those sanctions are applied, it's mandatory. So part of your duties as an organization is to demonstrate that you are actually meeting the requirements of your sanction screening. And I tend to carve that out into three main domains, if you like. So there's the internal needs within the organization. So that would be what mission statements maybe you've decided are important for the business. What's your ethical stance within the business? What are your corporate goals, your business goals, your operational goals, and how will you achieve those? And all of these, of course, then make up brand. And as you can imagine, failing to meet some sanctions lists will impact all of those dimensions. So that's the internal pressures, if you like. Then there's an external pressure or requirement. So those are all the business parties that you might be working with. So there could be partners, there could be contractors that you're working with. You could be going to joint ventures. It could be if you look at valuations and somebody is doing an audit on the strength of your finances. These things will determine the credibility of the business and how well you meet these regulatory requirements. And then, of course, there's the whole audit and the regulators themselves. So here I'm really thinking about external audit and the regulators who will have a deep dive into your business to ensure that you are adhering to the sanction requirements. So these have a real burden on the business. It's an operational burden that, of course, has a knock-on cost within the business, both in terms of human resources that are required to meet these needs, and then potentially the financial consequences of those resources. The actual financial costs to the business will be in the next slide, and we'll go into that in quite some detail, and that's quite interesting as well. Second bullet point, though, which is really important, that this is not a one-off activity. So you can't just set this up, let's say in 2024, and say, well, okay, I've done that. It's ongoing, and coming out or pulling some of the figures from what Bob was saying, the number of regulations that are out there and the frequency of the updates shows that this is changing. So if you did a snapshot, a set of analysis on your screening requirements, let's say a quarter ago, the data has changed, has moved. There are new people now on your entity list. There are new people now on your PEP list. You need to rescreen, and you basically need to keep on doing this. You could imagine the worst case is that every single financial transaction that you have, every single partner that you deal with, or any of those interactions, you should really screen against your lists to ensure whether you're about to violate one of your screening requirements. And reinforcing what Bob was saying, the size of that data that you're comparing against is increasing. It's more complex. So there's more regulations. The changes are increasing and accelerating. The complexity of the regulations are increasing, and regulations in the broader sense, but also sanctions in the detailed sense. And the penalties seem to be increasing as well. So the enforcement agencies seem to be more aggressive now. And having had successful cases in taking companies to court, that's going to encourage them that they can continue to do that and do more. So the penalties and the risk, the vulnerability for your organizations is increasing. And then we've got this overlap in terms of the jurisdictions and the targets. I mentioned 4 or 5, which are the key ones. And as Bob was saying, this is not all of them. And we happen to be talking about sanction lists and PEP lists today, but as I'm sure you guys will know, there are more areas of regulatory requirements. But the types of overlap would come by region, by entities, which entity you're dealing with, the people that you're dealing with, and the types and the sources of the sanction. So this is quite a complex data problem. And exactly as Bob was saying, if you've got this form problem where these regulations, although you can get them, some of them you might be able to get really easily, it's a PDF, but from an operational perspective, to turn that into actionable information within an organization that you can deal with that and compare that against your transactions is a burden. And what we're seeing with a lot of companies that we talk to, this function is often pushed into some backroom activity. It's often manual. And much as we hate to say this in the tech world, one of our biggest competitors is Excel. So often this is given to a small number of people sitting in a corner somewhere. They've got a list of Excel spreadsheets. They may be even doing something semi-smart where they're converting PDFs to Excel, or maybe they've got XML that they're importing into Excel and then running this somehow. But that's time consuming. It's prone to errors. Okay, you've got to watch out for errors, because errors means that you're not meeting your regulatory screening requirements. It's not multi-user. It's difficult to report on that. Also, it's very difficult to version that if you're using something that's manual or semi-manual. And that's a problem, because then it's not really auditable. You don't have the evidence of where this data came from and how you've dealt with the most up-to-date version of the data and how that's been applied in your processes. And that also means it's quite difficult to automate. And as I'm sure you all know, in the world that we're dealing in right now, there's a huge pressure to be competitive, to be lean, to do more with less being human and financial resources. So there is a tendency to automate as much as possible, which is good. But then if you've got a manual process that's sitting in the middle of this, that really is a problem around automation. So there are ways of dealing with this. So I suppose what I'm saying really, it's looking at where the trajectory of screening requirements, the trajectory of the complexity of data, and where that's heading. It's highly likely that what you're doing right now is not good enough. It's not going to take you where you need to be in a year, 2 years' time to deal with the size of this problem within the business. So this is the problem. This is a burden. Let's have a look at financial costs then to the business. So if we look at OFAC, during 2023, they imposed $1.5 billion of penalties for settlements in 2023. And that's the highest yet. So this number is increasing. And you can see one of the big ticket items there was to Binance Holdings of $1 billion settlement. I don't have figures for where they are in the 2024 totals. Wait until the end of the year to get that. But you can see that I've pulled up 3 examples. And so again, so big ticket items. So $0.9 million settlement for Vietnam Beverages. And this is to do with North Korea sanction violation. I should say that these are settlements. Okay, so none of these are an admission of guilt. It's a settlement. But SCG Plastics, a 20 million settlement. EFG, a 3.7 million settlement. Iran violations, Cuban violations. So reinforcing part of what Bob's been saying, this is multi-jurisdictional. So across the global landscape, these sanctions apply in multiple places depending on where you're doing business. And if you remember that little diagram I showed you from the EU sanctions map, those little circles represent particular sanctions. And these things are changing all the time. So new ones could pop in, new ones could fall out. So you have to keep up to date. But in terms of where you're doing business, so not just about the fines related to regulatory non-compliance, but where your revenue is coming from as a business, and showing really that sanctions do work. So here we can see the example that since Russia invaded Ukraine, the European Union's share of imports from Russia has dropped from just under 10% to around 2%. So that's a big shrink of where revenue could have come from if you were dealing with any of those companies. Similarly, Russia's share of exports fell from just under 4% to 1.4%. So if some of your revenue was related to selling to those companies, you can't. So you have to watch these sanction lists and understand what's changing. Where are my pressure points? Where can I no longer sell into that I could before? And the nature of what I could sell. This is complex. And just staying a little bit on the EU story. So if anyone's dealing in the EU, there's an update to the sanctions from the EU, and I think it's been ratified now as a directive, where the size of the fines could potentially, and Bob mentioned GDPR, which is the European Data Privacy Regulation, they're taking the same sort of stance where there's a large number of potential fines, so between 1 and 5% of the yearly worldwide turnover, or alternatively 8 or 40 million. So I guess depending on how the company is structured, what the sanction was. So these are big ticket items. This can severely impact the business's finances, but also their brand. So let's actually just dive into a use case which you might be familiar with already. So this is TD Bank, Toronto Dominion Bank. It looks like they've just settled to pay more than $3 billion as an agreement settlement for what's been a growing case. So initially it was an AML case, and this sprung out of it looks like 10 years worth of failing to properly address money laundering. So $18 trillion of money was flowing through their systems, and they didn't apply anti-money laundering properly. So they have been found out. And it looks like at the root of it, they didn't have appropriate compliance requirements for screening in place. So that was the first case of a significant fine. As an ongoing part of that investigation, it looks like they've also been guilty of bribery. So you can see the one bullet point there. So for a small number of bribes to an individual, that's led to a significant amount of money flowing outside into other companies, and it seems to be drugs related. So the financial consequences to this are significant as a fine. And then, of course, you'll see right at the bottom, this is obviously hitting the brand, but the share value for the bank dropped 5% based on the news. So it's a real hit. So mandatory, complex, costly. So what do we do? So we have developed an app. And the purpose for this app is to ease the pain of screening compliance, and to do it in a way that is really simple and very cost effective. Now if you go and look for applications that can do sanction screening and PEP screening, we're not the first people to work in this domain. But I think what's different, what's unique, is the combining of our capabilities, our kind of best of breed capabilities. So Red Genome's ability to take AI and transform these documents from a diverse type of content, PDF, XML, whatever, putting that together into something that's machine readable, and then in our world, taking that and then persisting that, as it happens in S4, in a very consumable way by a human being, takes away a lot of that pain and brings to a human being whose job it might be to worry about this, something that's really easy to use and really simple. This is not a 6-month implementation or a year-long implementation. This is really short. And we're basing it around the core elements of entities and individuals. So this is, if you're using the app, this is where you would start. You'd click on either entities or individuals. And if I go into individuals, it gives you a list of the individuals who are on a screening list, which could be PEPs, they could be for all sorts of reasons. And it's easily searchable, so you can see across the top. You can search by name, you can search by nationality, etc. If you drill into a particular row, so into a particular individual, that takes you into their details, and there could be multiple aliases, for example. There could be inconsistencies in place of birth, in date of birth. And these are the kinds of pieces of data that you need to look at to understand if somebody who you're investigating is on the list or not. Let's bring that immediately and very easily to your availability. Similarly, if you're looking at entities, so if you're doing KYC, for example, list of organizations who are on a list, and it could be a no trade list. You get the list really easy. You can search through it. Sorry, let me just get rid of that. And if I drill into that, I can see details about that organization, some aliases if there are, looking at the address, which they may be shifting that around, and the reason, for example, why they're on the list. So, we want to make this as simple as possible, as effective as possible, as cost effective as possible, and yet highly efficient. So what we've got as a kind of diagram of logical components, we've got this whole complex world over here, multiple types of data for different types of regulations from different providers of information being pulled together using smart AI technology to take all that complex stuff, suck out all the bits that are necessary to structure that, to put tags on top of that, which then makes it ideal to be read and used by an application, which we then persist the data in S4. And this is where the cost effectiveness comes from. So here I am a human being. I am dealing with sanctioned party list or screening, and I am in S4, and I can very quickly see, is this person on this transaction somebody I need to worry about? Or is this partner during KYC somebody I need to worry about? And I can deal with immediately. And then, as Bob was saying, if you look at the volume of changes in the last 120 days from the European Union and the US sanctions list, to keep up to date with the number of transactions or partners you're dealing with is hard. So we're making this easy, and easy to do, but easy to implement. And the thing about KYC as well is what I've seen a lot of companies do, and I've never quite got to the bottom of this of why, is they'll screen an organization when they first onboard them, but then they forget to check them 6 months later, and 6 months later, has anything changed? And that's really important as well, because you need to keep on doing that. So that's our first part of the message. So step one, this is what you can do, really easy, cost effective, making your life a lot simpler. We can take it a step further. We can start introducing elements of automation with another solution from the SAP portfolio and GRC portfolio. So there is a solution called SAP Risk and Assurance Management. So it's very lightweight, very cost effective, very easy to implement. And what it allows you to do, in fact, is automate the checking that a human being might be doing, and then supply to them the consequences of those automations. So basically, what you can do is automatically check what's on your sanction list from maybe a person list or an entity list against transactions in S4, and then show that for you, and you can then deal with the consequences of that. So that makes life, again, a lot easier. And from Winterhawk, we have, let's call them content packs, which you can add, bolt on to RAM to make that part easier. So we provide you with the jumpstart to do all this, do the implementation. And while we're talking about that story, so this is essentially bringing the automation into a risk and a control framework. If you're doing that, you can continue to extend the value of that effort and look at what are the additional business consequences of having some failure like that, but also what other parts of the business should fall under some kind of a risk and control framework, and I can pull these things together in one platform. So you can get other content packs, maybe based on lines of business or maybe based on particular industries. So again, your bang for your buck is much better. You can get a lot more value from that investment. Just a little screen diving into what that would look like. So this is now looking at the screen from Risk and Assurance Management. Let's see, I've got a mouse here. Yeah. So this could be a procure to pay process. It could be your KYC or your customer onboarding, know your customer process that you're looking at. I happen to have picked, just to make my life a little bit difficult, I've picked a sustainability example. So this is an organization that is worried about the failure of suppliers who might not be able to deliver goods due to drought, which, by the way, is a regulatory requirement. So we're still within the frame of regulations. But what I wanted to show you is you can document this control. You can decide what the revenue impact is for the business based on the control, and then you can automate that. So this is a piece of logic that sits in RAM, and it interrogates S4 based on a comparison. So saying, for this risk, in my transaction of data, I'm screening for particular entities. So in this case, we've got ISO names of countries, but it could be people in a P2P process. It could be organizations in a KYC process. Do any of them sit within my sanction party list? If so, raise an alert, deal with it. So we're trying to make that part a whole lot easier as well. And then that, let's want to extend that slightly into the broader remit. So the minute you're looking at topics like brand and financial loss, reputation within the business, it always has a broader consequence for the business. And where else can that be relevant, and how do you apply that? And if you're looking at S4 specifically, if you're going on an S4 migration, which is great, by the way, S4 itself is not risk-free. So S4 is a really good ERP system. I am ex-SAP. I was with SAP for 10 years. I think S4 is great. ECC is great. But it's not a risk management system. It's not a cybersecurity system. It's not a compliance system. It's not a user management system. You need other software to handle that. And also, as companies are moving down this digital transformation, more and more of their content is being consolidated, is gravitating towards the ERP system. You're looking for consolidation. You're looking for centralization. You're looking for simplification. You're looking for adoption of best practices. So more and more of your crown jewels end up in S4. So that becomes then a target for attack. But also, if there is any accidental loss or accidental processes, the exposure is more likely to be more severe because you've got more precious data in there. So that, if you overlay the sanction party list screening, this is part where it is the rubber meets the road, where we can help out there. So we can help enhance your S4 migration. So the business transformation that you're going through, and I've heard this described as you're flying an airplane, and while you're flying, you're busy rebuilding it. You're changing the wings, you're changing the engines, you're changing the pilot, you're changing the seating. So you need to keep going and keep safe. So your sanction party list screening, your PEP list screening still has to carry on. And you could be doing a cutover from ECC to S4 or changing some of the processes in S4. You still have to do the stuff. So our approach, our application for screening works. Our extending of that, doing the automation, works. It helps. It also helps you accelerate your time to value, which could be exactly what that is. So you have markets that you want to get to quickly, or you have offerings that you want to shrink the time to value. So that helps. But you could also be moving into new markets. So what is the level of risk as you move into a new market? You have tools like this that can help you. And maybe you think of going to the EU. Oh, all of a sudden I have to worry about EU sanctions and PEP lists. What's the cost to the business to do that? And should I do that? So it allows you to create new revenues with confidence because you know what your guardrails are and you know what your risk is as you move into these. And so from Winterhawk, we have, as I mentioned, we have these content packs which are ready to be plugged into software to help you do that really easy. So your barrier to entry is really low. So the solution I was talking about in this case is SAP Risk and Assurance Management. For those of you who have other legacy solutions within SAP, so you might be on ECC. First point is to say that while I've been talking about S4, SAP Risk and Assurance Management, we'll talk to ECC, it'll talk to S4 on-prem, as well as public cloud and private cloud. So that works. Our software product that we're talking about, the sanction party list screening, is on S4. Okay, so it's not ECC application, but it's on S4. But if you have SAP Process Control, which is a similar solution to RAM, the story could apply to PC as well as RAM. So just because we're talking about RAM and you're on PC, don't think, oh no, this doesn't apply to us. It does. And so some good things about the software. So it's hosted, so there's no corporate infrastructure. We offer a free deployment. It's also we help you with the ongoing enhancements and keeping up to date with the software and making sure you've got the best use of it. And helps you adopt some of the AI capabilities. And then I mentioned these content packs. So we have out-the-box content packs for these verticals. And that just means that your whole entry point, again, we're reducing that barrier, getting you to quick time to value, helping your S4 migration be smooth and safe. So we think this is a really strong message. So in summary, the first part, we looked at the challenges of regulations, and I briefly touched on sustainability. Oh, so what? Yeah, while I talk about sustainability, just to mention. So again, although a lot of you in the US, you might not be worried about the EU regulations around sustainability, so things like CSRD and so on. If you have operations in the European Union and you're above a certain revenue, you have to comply. So that is an issue. I know the US is a little bit weaker, let's say, than the Union on sustainability, but some of the states may. So it still could be interesting. But anyway, the cost effectiveness of our sanctions screening app is a significant advantage to your business. Reginome has taken away that complexity of this unformatted, unstructured data, human readable data, multiple types of sources, into this highly organized focus point of machine readable data. We pick that up, we persist that in S4, exposing that to the human beings. It's so easy to do. It's so cost effective to do. You don't need an army of consultants to do it. So it's nimble. It's really easy to use. It's really easy to learn. And what we're doing is we're augmenting an existing human process. And that's important because it takes that person who was doing the job away from a low value activity. So, where is the data? Is my Excel up to date? To a high value activity of what is the business impact? What are the consequences to the business? And by the way, so TD Bank, in one of the articles, it looked like they're going to hire something like 700 people to step their compliance projects right, so they can do this better. So maybe if they had a solution like that, they wouldn't be in this pickle in the first place, and they wouldn't have to get those 700 people. And it's AI powered, so this is really an effective use of technology to take this hard content into machine readable and then embed it and use it within software. And then you can extend that story using, for example, risk and assurance management. You can automate things significantly if you want to go down that road. Reduce the human effort again, and then again increase the value of what they're doing. And we have this package capability, so it makes it easier. Your barrier of entry is really low, and we're basically experts in this stuff, and can help you integrate that with your ERP systems. So this is our contact details. So obviously you can find myself and Bob on LinkedIn. These are our generic email addresses, but I want to hand back to Bob to get some of his insights based on what we've been discussing so far.
Thanks, Neil. Look, I think, I just, from my perspective, close with an observation. So when we started talking to Winterhawk, probably 6 months ago about this, what really struck me is the market gap that they described for a solution that would be a fraction of the cost of existing solutions that could augment a human process by leveraging the AI that we leverage in our document processing, doing it at scale, and combining with their understanding of the market to deliver a pretty simple solution in the first instance, like out of the gate. If you, as Neil said, if you want to build from there, great. But that spreadsheet tool is pervasive. But it really comes down to me, what really struck me as interesting is that if you can price something compellingly that really makes someone's job easier and everybody sleeps better at night, you've got something compelling. And I think bringing our data together with the solution capability of Winterhawk can achieve that. And so I think that's the bottom line for me. I think that's what really drew us to engage in investing the effort to build this with Winterhawk.
Couldn't have said it better myself, Bob. Thank you. And guys, thank you so much for spending the time to attend this session. You can get the recording later on, and as you're saying, feel free to reach out to us, and we'd love to talk to you.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for taking the time. Goodbye.